Welcome, everybody, to WPC On the Go. Happy Earth Day. This is a special Earth Day edition of WPC On the Go. Usually we do it on Tuesdays, but since today is Earth Day, we thought we would do it today. And we have a few really interesting guests to join us to talk about on-the-ground Earth Day efforts. As you know, one of the things that we talk about all the time is how the power of individual efforts using the market and incentives and other things like that is an effective way to promote environmental stewardship. So as you know, I'm Todd Myers. I'm the Environmental Director at the Washington Policy Center. And before we turn to our guests, I want to talk about a couple of things it seems strange sometimes for people on the center right to be celebrating Earth Day. It is generally seen to be as more of a holiday for environmental activists who are generally considered on the left. But as I say every year on Earth Day, we shouldn't do that because obviously people who care about the environment across the political spectrum, people across the political spectrum are ranchers, farmers, hikers, hunters, fishers. We all care about being good stewards of the environment, and many of the people who are on the political right obviously live close to the environment. And so it's something that we should all embrace. And the challenge of doing that, though, is that often politics are wrapped up in environmental policy and how we choose to help the environment. And the problem with that increasingly is that those politics are overwhelming the effectiveness of the efforts that we have. We choose policies based on what is politically comfortable, what is ideologically comfortable, or what makes us feel good. And those policies are not always the same as the one that yield the best environmental outcomes. So for instance, we're going to be talking about salmon today. As many of you know, I spent about 10 years on the Puget Sound Salmon Recovery Council, and there is widespread frustration that we aren't doing better to recover salmon. And in fact, NOAA Fisheries in their research found that between 2005 and 2019, populations of Chinook in Puget Sound actually slightly declined. Not for lack of effort. We've done a lot of things, but there are still a lot of challenges. We also have Cindy Mitchell, who is with us with the Washington Forest Protection Association, and every summer we now can expect smoke in the air because of unhealthy forests. We're not making the progress that we should be making, especially on federal lands, in improving the health of our forests. And so that's another area that we are struggling. And lastly, although there is a huge amount of focus on reducing CO2 emissions, and we constantly talk about how in Washington State we are leaders in reducing CO2 emissions, the facts say something different. In fact, we are not doing very well when it comes to reducing emissions. Emissions went up every year during Governor Inslee's administration up until 2019. And the only reason I stopped there is we don't have any data for 2020, 2021, 2022, or 2023. So we don't know how we're doing, but the trend is not good. So the challenges that we face, from salmon to forests to CO2 emissions or whatever else we care about in the environment, the trends, many of the trends are not good, and the policies that we are relying on aren't working out. So that's why I'm particularly excited to have the guests that we have today, because they are working on the ground to make things better and come up with innovative solutions to the challenges, some of the challenges that I've just talked about. So first, I want to introduce Peggen Frank. She is with Salmon Defense, where she has been since 2011. She received a bachelor from Evergreen State College with an emphasis in sustainable business. And she has a master's degree in public administration and an emphasis in tribal government. And the reason I wanted to bring Peggen and then Cecilia Gobin on is to talk about Salmon Defense and the work that they are doing to recover salmon and the challenges that we face. Before we talk about that, I wanted to cite one study that stuck out at me that I just thought was really remarkable. They looked at conservation projects around the world and what were successful and what weren't. And what they found is that conservation projects run by governments, typically located in capitals, where you have the bureaucracies running it from the capitals, about 20% of the conservation of the projects achieve their conservation goals. But projects that were run locally, often by tribal communities and tribal governments, were 50% successful. And that's because people closest to the problem are often best at identifying what needs to be fixed and identifying solutions, and they have a stake in it. And that's certainly the case of tribes in Washington State with the case of salmon. So with that, Peggen, thank you so much for joining us. Tell me a little bit about Salmon Defense and what you guys are up to and where you see the opportunities to recover salmon.
Absolutely. Thank you, Todd, and the Policy Center. We're really honored and grateful to be on your platform today, especially on Earth Day, to tell our tell our viewers what they can do and how they can help us turn the tide for salmon. My name is Peggen Frank. I'm an enrolled Northern Arapaho. I'm the Executive Director of Salmon Defense. I was also had the privilege of being Billy Frank Jr.'s daughter-in-law and had a front row seat in the Billy Frank Jr. University. And so through my relationship as being his daughter-in-law, I was quickly became a salmon warrior myself. And so Salmon Defense is a small nonprofit. We were created by the vision and visioning of the late Billy Frank Jr. in 2003 to litigate, advocate, and educate on behalf of Pacific Northwest salmon through the lens and direction of the 20 Northwest Washington Treaty Tribes. And we've done mostly education and advocacy work with our Washingtonians. We have the Tribal Voices Archive, which is a great source for folks that are looking for primary research when it comes to co-management and what tribes have been doing since the Bolt decision up to today, and how they're managing their end of the agreement or the litigation. And then we also, in 2018, we created the Billy Frank Jr. Salmon Coalition. And this was really a collaboration and a vision of the late Lorraine Loomis, who was also one of our founding board members. And in 2018, it felt like everything was kind of falling apart. And so we created this amazing coalition, the Billy Frank Jr. Salmon Coalition, and we are 100% dedicated to protecting salmon in Washington State. The coalition is made up of a diverse group of past, present, and future tribal leaders, environmental scientists, local and state officials, recreational fishermen, attorneys, conservation groups, and industry. We believe and are committed to making progress together on the three fronts, which are habitat protection and restoration, which is protecting all remaining habitat and advocating for restoring degraded habitat and for progressive action on climate change issues in Washington, and hatchery production, hatchery production. We value hatcheries for their role in helping maintain salmon populations while we combat habitat degradation and restore habitat. So those out there, you'll probably hear most of our tribal co-managers saying that hatchery fish are treaty fish. And until we can restore habitat, which is the ultimate goal, all of Washington will have to rely on hatchery production in order for us to have fish on our tables. And then lastly, pinniped management, which Cecilia will touch on. We're looking for solutions to manage the pinniped population, that's seals and sea lions, for those who don't know what pinnipeds are. So that predation on both adult and juvenile salmon and the forage fish they depend on does not have an out-of-balance effect or impede the recovery of our dwindling salmon populations. And so we believe that together the strength of our voices is unstoppable. And taking the next step has been to create a communications campaign, which many may have been seeing for the last 4 weeks. And what we really wanted to do with this communications campaign, on top of forming the Billy Frank Jr. Coalition and getting started and developing our 3 principal tenets, what we realized is that there was a significant need for our Washingtonians to understand the complexities of salmon restoration in our state. Can you believe that we have 30 to 60,000 people moving into our state each month, and the majority of these people, while they see Washington as a gym, they don't realize that we have this really unique system of co-management, and how co-management continues to provide salmon to all of us, and is a benefit for us all. So we've been working on this communications campaign. This is our last week, and we're very excited to have it continue going. We have a website called salmonwarriors.org. We've produced a great 4-minute introduction piece of what our 3 principal tenets are, and we're trying to help our Washingtonians see themselves in salmon restoration and join us in becoming salmon warriors.
That's great. Thank you. That's a fantastic introduction to the work that you guys are doing. As Donald just pointed out, for those of you who have questions, put them in the Q&A. My first question to you, Peggen, is to talk to a little bit about the role of tribal hatcheries. As you said, hatchery fish are treaty fish. So tribal hatcheries have been really productive and really a big part of making sure that we have those fish. Talk a little bit about what you've done and why those are so important.
Yeah, so a lot of the 20 Northwest Washington tribes each have hatcheries on their watersheds and their systems, and they're all using and have been using the best available science to decipher how many millions of salmon that they produce and create to put back in the system. And they all work with the co-managers to kind of keep track of where all these salmon are going and where they're coming, how they're coming back. And, that integrates the harvest portion into it, and how we're all able to put fish on our tables and enjoy them. And so that it's really a robust and complex system, which is very important. And some people kind of have this premise that the hatchery fish are impeding on the wild fish, which hasn't really been scientifically proven theory. And so where we have to rely on these hatchery fish until we can fully restore the habitat. And it's really quite amazing to me to go out and visit the hatcheries that our tribes have, and see how amazing and robust these systems are, from the spawning to the creating the eggs trays, and all the way up until the releases. It just always baffles me that tribes have to go to this certain extent, but to be able to harvest salmon that was guaranteed in their treaties.
Yeah, we did. So a few years ago, the Policy Center, we did a video with the Nisqually tribe and David Trout, who runs their program of their tribal hatchery and some of the things that they're doing. And as you point out, it's very complex. And there's a concern that is expressed sometimes about the impact on wild fish. But like you, I was sort of really impressed by a couple of things. One, the work that is being done on genetics to make sure that there's genetic diversity among those fish. And then second, to make sure that the timing of the release of hatchery fish do not impede on wild. So you're not putting out a bunch of fish all at once and having the wild and hatchery fish compete against each other. It's really a cool and complex, and there's lots of new things that you guys are researching all the time.
Yeah, and constantly using the best available science.
Yeah. So we have two other folks who have joined us, Fran and Cecilia, and so they can talk about different aspects. I don't know if Peggen, if you wanted to introduce one of them to talk about another aspect of the work that you're doing.
Yeah. Hi, Fran. It's great to have you join us. If you could please give us a short introductory and explain a little bit about the habitat restoration and what it means and what it entails.
I'm Fran Wilshusen. I work as the Director of Environmental Protection at the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission and with Salmon Defense since its inception to kind of share the leadership that the tribes here in the Pacific Northwest have with the region more broadly. The work that we're doing right now with the communication campaign is really about empowering each of us. So many people that live here love this place and are wanting to be part of it, whether it's walking on the beach or having a meal overlooking the water, seeing the mountains as they're driving. But few understand what all is going on. And the work I do with environmental protection, the roads that we're driving on, the houses that we're building, the prosperity that this region has is directly affecting the place itself. And so the big challenges we have right now are about growth and how we do the growth. It's not that we don't want to grow, and it's not that we don't want to be a prosperous place, but we want to do it in a healthy kind of way. And every day we're learning so much about, used to be the Clean Water Act was about visible, the lakes and rivers were literally on fire and there was tires in them and it was a very visible kind of problem. Today it's more of an invisible kind of concern where it's toxic runoff, and these roadways that we've built, the interstates and the highways are incredible delivery systems of toxins coming off of something as basic as our car tires. And I think most people have heard about that now, the 6-ppdq that's part of the makeup of our tires and coming off the road. But there's so many others, including what we put on the road, on our lawns, drippings from our cars, direct discharge into the sound from wastewater treatment systems to other industrial discharges. And it all adds up to a very depleted ecosystem that really is on the edge of tipping over.
So I think that's it. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. That's
No.
a really good point, which is that when we talk about, environmental protection, we talk about the Clean Water Act. And the Clean Water Act was about these big outfalls that we're doing a lot. As you've pointed, the types of challenges that we face are very different. There are lots of little inputs, little bits of tire rubber, 6-ppd, those sorts of things. So how do we deal with the changing nature of the impact on salmon from those sorts of things in runoff?
Well, that's part of what we're working on right now. Is it's about awareness. It's about all of us recognizing. I mean, when we understand these things, we can make the changes. That same technology that makes us so able to grow and be the region that we are can also result in change. And so looking for solutions for some of these toxins that we've been used to using, they're not just not good for the fish, they're not good for anybody. And so doing that kind of work together to become aware of what is it that we're using. All of us have witnessed Roundup coming from something that everybody thought was just a convenient and don't worry, it gets broken down as soon as it gets into the soil and water. It's not. And so many things are like that. So I guess the short answer, Todd, would be learning and becoming part of the solution to the problem by our own awareness. And then hopefully we can move together as salmon warriors, as participants in the, the ecology that we are. We're part of this place too. How do we want to do that? More and more, we're seeing people choosing to have lawns that are different than traditionally. They're incorporating different sorts of plants. They're not requiring the same kind of manicured system. We're just beginning to see that awareness. So I think all of us learning, understanding the connection of our own actions day by day on place is is probably the most powerful thing we can do. And then we can get into the politics of it too. Most politicians don't do anything if it not going to make them look good. So helping them see that we do know what these things are and that we expect them to be helping to make the change. And I just want to say one more thing before I close on that, is that it's not going to be easy. We're talking about societal change. And that's hard on a politician because it takes time to make a change like that. And so bit by bit, steadying a consistent pathway to something healthier, something more sustainable is, I think, what we need to do.
I think there's a couple of things in there that I really like. One is that you talk about, that all of us doing little things add up to big things. I think that there is too often a common approach that says, well, let's let government take care of it. Let's let politicians take care of it. The things we do can make a difference. And I think that isn't appreciated enough. And the other thing I will just say is that having worked in environmental policy for 25 years now, the challenge with politics and political approaches is that in one election, the best laid plans can get turned around. And so sustainable long-term approaches that, as you talk about, that are incremental, that start on the ground, I think can be really powerful and are less susceptible to those types of political changes. And so that's why I really appreciate the work that you guys are doing. So thank you. I think at this point, we should probably turn to Cecilia and talk a little bit about how we deal with pinnipeds and predation of salmon. So Cecilia, I will just start this and maybe you can talk a little bit more about this. But last year, there was a great report released by the Washington Academy of Sciences about the impact of seals and sea lions on salmon populations. And it actually said that they were having a significant impact on salmon recovery and actually recommended some pilot projects to deal with it. So tell me, what are you looking at and what are the types of things that we need to do to reduce the impact?
Yeah, thanks, Todd, and thanks for the invitation to join you guys here. As Peggen mentioned, this is one of the platforms of the Billy Frank Jr. Salmon Coalition, one of the key areas of work that they wanted to focus on and do just as you mentioned, Todd, is to focus in on some of those areas that the Academy of Sciences report highlighted. We were aware of that report. The tribes as co-managers worked closely with DFW and the Academy to have our technical and biological expertise on that panel to help look at that issue for the region. So we were aware of it, and we were, I don't want to say pleasantly pleased with the findings, just because it did document an impact. But I think what it did, and for the region, was actually document and confirm what I think anecdotally, tribal fishers and non-tribal fishers have been experiencing firsthand on the water, which is these impacts from increased populations of seals and sea lions and the predation effect that they were having on salmon stocks. The other thing, in just documenting the impact, that's part of the kind of the groundwork, the technical work that we have to do, right, when we're looking at any type of resource management or habitat issue. We have to do that technical work to then inform the policy. And that was a big step forward with the Academy of Sciences piece that we were supportive of, and that we wanted the work to move forward on. But we're also looking at other issues and other avenues that we need to address this issue. One of the big ones is the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which that Academy of Sciences report also looked at, if you recall, that said, similar to your recent discussion on the Clean Water Act, these regulations, these statutes were put in place in a time when they were very much needed. But with the Marine Mammal Protection Act, for example, there's no exit ramp, if you will, similar to ESA, for example, when you can get to delisting or when you can get to kind of avenues in which to manage populations that are otherwise protected. So under the Marine Mammal Protected Act, it protects all marine mammals, seals, sea lions, whales, dolphins, polar bears, all of that, writ large, which is great and which is needed. But what happens when those populations are reaching carrying capacities in their environments, in their watersheds? How do you address that? And the Marine Mammal Protection Act is silent on that, in so much as outlining steps to then authorize management actions, whether that's lethal management, whether that's reducing haul out areas for seals or sea lions to reduce their congregation in key bottlenecks that then would more or less promote their predation on salmon. So we're looking at what types of policy and legislative changes might need to happen, congressional amendments to these types of national policies. And then, of course, working closely with our co-managers on this issue, the tribes and the state together, trying to find what's going to make sense from an ecosystem-based management perspective of how you manage this increasing limiting factor on salmon recovery. I won't shy away from the fact that we're not talking about potential lethal removal options. But I do want to also say that, that's not a decision that either one of tribes or the state resource managers take lightly either. And it would be very direct and scientifically grounded and managed and documented, and all of that kind of foundational work to then inform an adaptive management action such as lethal removal. But that's not the only option that we're looking at either, certainly. And I don't think it's the one right out of the gate. We're also looking at some of these key bottlenecks that we just know are issues for seals and salmon, the Ballard locks. We have an example on the Columbia River at the dam. People have cited the Hood Canal Bridge as a issue that kind of creates this unique eddying effect where salmon get caught up and they can't get out under the bridge. And then, seals and sea lions, they're not dumb creatures. And, why wouldn't you eat something that's a little easier to get than, expending more energy than you have to? So, looking at some of those infrastructure needs that maybe we need to address and kind of attenuate to into systems. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, one of the most, when I take people when I tell people, if you want to see all of the problems of salmon recovery, go to the Ballard locks, because you have hot water, you have, challenges of getting through, you have runoff, you have seals and sea lions. One of the amazing things in that report from the Washington Academy of Sciences is that they said that they estimated that the population of seals and sea lions is higher today than it was pre-settlement. Which, it gives you a sense of how serious a problem that is. It's not, if you looked at the number of wildlife or salmon or anything, and you said the population is higher today than it was 200 and 300 years ago, That's pretty rare. And yet to have that, I think gives you a good sense of how important it is to address that.
Yeah, and I think too, you know, like salmon being a canary in the coal mine, I would argue, and I do argue that you know, these increased, really ballooned population numbers of seals and sea lions are indicators of an ecosystem out of balance themselves, and in so much as they indicate that there's an imbalance in the system on a whole. Food web dynamics are out of balance because harbor seals, for example, they eat salmon here and there, but that's not all they historically have eaten. You know, it's forage fish, it's ground fish, and you know, let's look at those populations and where are we at with those? And those are depressed as well. And so it's all kind of this nesting effect and kind of cumulative impact, if you will, that needs to be looked at and needs to be addressed in the whole. And I would say, I guess, finally, before I just pause for any comments or question, is, you know, the tribes especially are aware that addressing pinniped predation on salmon is not the silver bullet. It is certainly an immediate action that we can take to help alleviate a very real-time stress on you know, depressed salmon stocks, but it's certainly not going to be the be-all end-all. We're on the other side of the tipping point where it is just one action in a suite of actions that need to take place if you know, if we're serious about having salmon in the future of Washington. So
I think that's a great place to finish. Thank you so much. I think that's there is no silver bullet. In fact, I wrote a piece for the Seattle Times last year saying that there are no silver bullets and we need to do lots of things. And so that's why I really appreciate the work of Salmon Defense, is that you are working on many of those different pressures. Peggen, anything you wanted to, I could talk about this forever because this is a really interesting topic and it's important to me, but Peggen, anything you want to finish up with before we turn to Cindy?
No, again, just thank you. Thank you for your time, letting us, having us be on your platform to talk about our three principal tenets: habitat restoration, hatchery production, and pinniped management. Like Cecilia said, if we're to have salmon in our future, we've got to do these immediate actions quicker. Please visit salmonwarriors.org and join us.
That's great. I was just going to ask you where they can find you. So that's perfect. Well, so thank you, Peggen, Fran, and Cecilia, so much. We really appreciate you sharing today.
Thank you.
All right, Cindy. So I'm very pleased to have Cindy Mitchell joining with us because I have known Cindy forever, almost as long as I've been working on environmental policy. She works with the Washington Forest Protection Association, and I met her when I was at the Department of Natural Resources. And she is one of the people that, when I have a question about what's going on in forestry and where we are on different issues, she is one of the people I can rely on. So thank you so much. I wanted to talk about sort of the work that the forest landowners are doing to make sure that we have sustainable and healthy forests, which is important, and then also about carbon, because that's become a big issue. But I do want to tell one story that I think about the power of private forest land and the revenue that they generate. As many people know that have heard of the Forest and Fish Law, and one of the things in the Forest and Fish Law was to remove culverts that blocked salmon habitat. This is an issue we are still dealing with, and in fact, the tribes had to sue the state to get the state to fix their culverts. But on private lands, the culverts were basically fixed on time by 2015. And the reason is that when you generate revenue, you have the money to do that, to do the work that needs to get done for that environmental restoration. If you're relying on politicians and relying on the budget, they may or may not prioritize it. And that's ultimately what happened was that because the politicians weren't prioritizing it, they had to get sued. And so I think private forest land and stewardship of private forest is a really great story, not just in terms of the products, the economics, the jobs, but also environmental stewardship. So with that, I'll stop talking and bragging about the good work that you guys do. And Cindy, I'll turn it over to you to talk a little bit about WFPA and private forest land and what you're doing to make sure our forests are healthy and sustainable.
Well, thank you, Todd, and thank you for having us on as well. And with the excellent panelists, Peggen, Cecilia, and Fran, it's an honor to be in the same forum with you. The Washington Forest Protection Association was founded in 1908, mainly the large private forest landowners, which accompany about 22% of all the forests in Washington state. And we are a part of the Billy Frank Salmon Coalition because we too manage across about 4 million acres, and you have streams that run through the forest. And so making sure that the water is cool and clean for when salmon do return, we're doing our part for salmon recovery. More recently, we've been dealing with carbon issues and some confusing messaging. I think it's confusing where it's saying that not managing the forest is the better outcome for carbon. And that really conflicts with the actual experience on the ground. I mean, if we didn't manage the forest, that would be more susceptible to wildfire or overstocking or dry and drought conditions. And it's really that healthy, resilient forest that we need. This was, in fact, the genesis of the Billy Frank and Stu Bledsoe initial Timberfish Wildlife Agreement, that we need to look out many, many generations over the landscape to see how we can keep the forests and the wildlife and the water and air clean and healthy and resilient. So I love the way you opened it, Todd, where you talked about how the politics are getting in the way of really good science and on the ground policies. And so while 20 years ago, we worked with all the stakeholders to create the Forest and Fish Law, that covers 9 million acres and 60,000 miles of streams. We're now having pressure to not manage the forests. And it flies in the face of all the scientific evidence that we have for carbon and for healthy, resilient landscapes. So, so I'm the Senior Director of Public Affairs, and I've been at WFPA for almost as long as Todd's career, maybe a few years longer. So we've been around these discussions for a very long time and are committed to doing our part for salmon recovery, air quality, and production of wood products and supporting jobs. When I look at the current narrative, what bothers me the most, I'll just share one slide, Todd. It's this particular slide. Let me see if I can bring it up. I think this is the biggest misconception of the day, which is not managing the forest is the best way to mitigate carbon. And when you don't manage the forest, there's all kinds of things that happen. People don't have jobs. The forest becomes a cost center. So then it's harder to do projects like you mentioned with the barrier removal, which private landowners alone removed 9,000 barriers to fish habitat, opening up 6,500 miles of streams. But when you look at it through a carbon lens, it also doesn't work as well as to set aside forest as managed forests. Many people don't really realize is when the tree grows, it's going to absorb carbon dioxide, but the carbon stays in the tree and the tree releases oxygen. Well, that carbon is there in the tree and in the wood. In fact, that's what the wood is. About 50% of that tree, the weight of that tree is carbon. So when you build with it, when you harvest the tree, when you use the wood, then that's still carbon that you are using and storing. And then with private landowners who intensively manage much more so than other landowners, we do it in a cycle to where twice as much carbon is being stored and 3 times as much carbon is being stored when you consider the wood product. So twice as much per acre is coming out of the atmosphere, 3 times as much is being stored if you include the wood, than unmanaged forests. And I really feel like we're all suffering, kind of ranging widely here for a minute, because it's all connected back to healthy, resilient forests, healthy populations of salmon, healthy populations of wildlife. And there are a lot of factors that are, Fran mentioned the awareness. I agree. It's an invisible problem. Carbon's an invisible problem in a certain way when we're talking about removal of carbon dioxide or storage of carbon. But what's very visible is when we sit and smoke. And all of us have experienced that, and it's very treacherous for families and people who are in communities that they can't get away from the smoke. But when you look at our forests writ large, and this will be my last point here, Todd, is that in the state, federal land managers of our national forests own and manage the most forests, 37%. Private forest landowners, the large ones, manage 22%, and smalls manage 21%. And then the state has about 15%. Well, of those different levels of intensity of management, 94% of the federal forest is offline from managing. And what that results in is 70% of that tree growth is dying each year. So that's dying, that's emitting carbon, that's creating drought conditions, and a tinderbox worth of fuel for wildfire. On the state level, it's 50-50. 50% is managed and 50% is unmanaged, and they have 26% mortality each year. On private forests, about 20% is restricted from harvest, so 80% of the forest is being managed, producing wood products, and they have the lowest mortality at 14%. So from that science from the University of Washington, we look at that and say you've got to manage the forest and not just set aside trees thinking they will grow forever and stay in the same state that they are now. And that is one of the biggest narratives that we're battling. And when it comes to any wildlife or natural landscape, management has always been part of the landscape for as long as humans have been here. So it's not a new concept. And with more and more population coming in, it's more important to understand that as well as take care of our natural environment. I'll pause there.
So there's one aspect that was fantastic. And I think you say that there is this, I think, very simplistic logic that says just leaving trees standing stores the carbon. But of course, as you mentioned, there's a couple of problems. One is that it doesn't store, right? They start to decay. They start to actually to emit carbon. California did a survey where they looked at working forests and non-working forests, and they found that non-working forests were actually emitting more carbon than they were storing, whereas working forests were actually absorbing carbon. But there's one other aspect I want you to talk about, which is that if we're going to build, if we're going to, build houses and buildings and things like that, it's not just that wood stores carbon, it's that the alternatives are worse, have bigger impact. So talk a little bit about the comparison of if you don't have wood to build with, and you build with concrete or steel or other things like that, what the impact is comparatively.
Yeah, and people don't necessarily look at it this way, but there's a lot of statistics that look at the built environment that say, oh, if you add it all together, all the actions that happen in the built environment, that sector alone emits 40% of our global carbon. And as we add more and more people, not just to our state, but around the world, the choice of building materials becomes a part of that equation, in addition to energy efficiency and, living type conditions. There's all kinds of aspects of the built environment. But what you're talking about, Todd, is the material choice. And the evergreen state is a state in the United States that grows trees the best, has the highest productivity ground of any other state in the country. And so what we do well here in this evergreen state should be our contribution to the global climate crisis. And if we don't harvest the trees here and we affect the resiliency of the forest, we're not only not providing the most sustainable building material in the world, we're also creating problems for ourselves and importing from other countries, or maybe even other states, but more likely other countries, the wood products that we need to build homes. I believe we're 250,000 units behind keeping up with our population in terms of home building. So if we don't harvest our trees here and we allow other more carbon intensive materials to be the dominant source of our built environment, that is a double, triple whammy for our state, for the climate issue, and for it's lack of awareness of understanding how renewable and sustainable wood is, and how natural it is to use wood from responsibly managed forests, unlike taking in steel from China or mining the other materials that you would use to build wood. So it's super important to your material choice for the built environment.
The one question I always get, and I want to make sure that you address, is replanting. Talk about replanting and then what that does, right? How you have, when you harvest and then replant, what that does over time to store more carbon than just leaving trees on the ground.
So the couple of factors, one is there's always going to be a certain proportion of trees left on the ground for the diversity of the ecosystem. But in a privately intensively managed forest, 18% is left in the forest, and the rest is going to some form of a market. So all parts of that tree are used. And the cycle is every 50 to 80 years or so, the trees that have been managed that long are going to be harvested, and that carbon's going to go into the built environment. And then within the next planting season, the law says 3 years, but honestly, folks that are managing forests want to start that new plantation as soon as possible. They'll be planting within the next 6 months or so. And those faster growing trees that have to be carefully managed at that point from animal damage and flood and fire and all that. So you're managing that younger crop, but it's storing way more carbon as the tree grows. As the tree grows faster, it is taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere faster, and then it hits a peak, sort of like us. We're teenagers, we grow fast, we eat a lot of food, and then in the middle ages we start slowing down and then eventually decline. That's the life cycle of a tree, and then we start new again. I believe it was Gifford Pinchot that said a forest without new growth is like a family without children. And so we're in this constant cycle of replanting and renewal after the timber harvest. Of all the land that's managed in Washington, about 2% of the land is forest land is harvested each year, and then the replanting cycle goes within that following calendar year generally.
Let me just say, I'm not a teenager anymore, but I still eat a lot.
Okay. Right.
So yeah, so that's I think that's great. I think as we talked about, there's a lot of pressure to stop all timber harvesting on state trust lands,
Mhm.
which would mean the loss of tens of millions of dollars to schools. People don't understand that. It's actually, like I said, it's a great system because it not only people focus on the jobs, but forests are not static. They
Right.
are dynamic. And managing forests is something that occurs either naturally or has had human influence for a long time, and we can mirror that in a lot of ways. Anything you want to finish up with? Let people know before we conclude with this topic.
Well, I would say that collaboration is key. And I know that the timber sector works with Native American tribes because we're probably the largest natural resource managers in the state when combined. And the resources are so important for all of us, but especially when we talk about salmon for tribes and for everyone else too. And the health of our ecosystem is going to reflect the health of who we are. So collaboration is the key, and we value our relationship in working with tribes, especially Peggen and Cecilia and Fran. And so thank you very much, Todd.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. It's always good to see you. So thank you. Before we go, we did have one question that I wanted to address. I'm sorry we didn't get to address the other ones, but there was one question about microplastics and plastic pollution. Not everything is about climate change these days. It's a really good question, and I just wanted to address this, which is that we are seeing there's an increased concern, obviously, about plastic, especially in the water, and we have to be smart about how we address it. There are some important uses of plastic for medical and other things like that. But one of the things that we did in Washington State was ban plastic grocery bags in the hopes that it would reduce the amount of plastic going into the water. And that's true in some cases. But what the research shows is that the vast majority of plastic that goes into the ocean comes from developing countries. And there was a study earlier this year that New Jersey also banned plastic grocery bags, and the use of plastic actually increased because people were substituting more plastic for what they lost. And so you have to be careful that the cure isn't worse than the disease. But there are really cool things going on. And one of my favorite organizations is called Plastic Bank. And what Plastic Bank does is that they work with people in developing countries to remove plastic from beaches that could go into the ocean. They then sell that plastic to companies like SC Johnson. So when you go to the store, you can see a Windex bottle, and that Windex bottle will say made with ocean-bound plastic. Already, they have collected, and this is, very small, simple efforts, but they have collected the equivalent of more than 6 billion plastic bottles that could have gone into the ocean. Wow. It's really remarkable. And so those are the kinds of efforts that I think you see where you get rewarded for actual results that are really effective and go to where the problem is. And I think back to Fran's point about that there's lots of little inputs. It's not just big inputs anymore, that dealing with small problems adds up to big environmental benefits. And so that's an area where we see it. With that, we are a little bit past 1 o'clock, so we're going to conclude. Thank you so much to all of our guests, to Cindy, to Peggen, to Fran, and to Cecilia, talking about all the works that they are doing to make Washington better environmentally. And then I will finish by saying Happy Earth Day. And we will post this. If you missed any of it, we will post this up. And then also follow us at Washington Policy Center for more ideas about how to engage individuals to be good stewards of the planet. Thank you so much.